Thank you so much for joining us today, Tom. We really appreciate it. I want to go ahead and start with the news that the U.S. officials are investigating whether the airport bombers were targeting American tourists because the explosions happened near those ticket counters for U.S. airlines. Do these attacks suggest to you that Americans were targeted?
Well, it may be coincidence, it may be targeting, but I guess if you're going to target Americans, those who would congregate outside of the three major U.S. commercial carriers would be a good place to start. And obviously Brussels, a home of the European Union, the home of NATO. So there's a convergence of interests that are contrary to the interest of ISIS that celebrate the Western world that could very well have been the target. And unfortunately, it's where you can maximize with the congregation of people lined up waiting to get tickets and move through those lines. It's a pretty significant centerpiece for a targeted attack. A lot of people aggregate and hang around those areas.
Oh, absolutely. I want to ask you the other piece of news that we're hearing this afternoon. The Associated Press reporting now that ISIS has dispatched at least 400 fighters to carry out attacks in Europe. It says that fighters have been instructed to find the right time, the right place, and a method to carry out a mission. What do you make of that information and that number?
Well, a couple of things come to mind. One is how effective their communication network is. They have their own communication team, and we accept whatever they say. My second reaction was there's probably a little hyperbole in that, but whether there's 4 that are going, 40 that are going, 400, the number is almost is not as significant as the fact that if they have sent any number of people into Europe, there's already a very supportive infrastructure in many of these countries that will provide the logistical support, perhaps develop the weapons, give them a safe haven and sanctuary until they try to carry out their attack. So the number isn't as important, in my view, as the existing infrastructure. But regardless of who they sent, I think Europe's going to have to be on very, very high alert and extraordinary vigilance over the next several months.
Well, I want to ask you about that. Are you surprised that ISIS does have the level of infrastructure right now established in Europe?
I'm not surprised that ISIS has the infrastructure in Europe. We know for a fact that thousands of Europeans have gone from Europe to Syria and Iraq, which means that those who have left their communities, left their families, probably left behind some sympathizers as well. And so it does not surprise me. And obviously, you can take a look at how many of the European countries have dealt with this mass migration, not just in the past year or so from Syria, but over the past couple of years, these little enclaves, these little sanctuaries of unrest, of poverty, and the like, natural breeding grounds for some of the discontent and some of the appeal for ISIS. But no, I'm not surprised at all that this has occurred. I'm not surprised that there are a lot of sympathizers in Europe who I would call them enablers.
Well, that's, I want to ask you, because a lot of times they're called those boomerang type people who go to Syria and Iraq and they fight and they make their way back. But people up until this point didn't think that was happening. As you're saying right now, sympathizers potentially were left behind. Do you think there are any of these boomerang type terrorists now entering Europe?
Well, it's interesting. There's some of the reports say that 1 or 2 of these bombers may have gone to Syria in 2013. I don't know how accurate that is. But again, I think one of the circumstances that I think we need to understand in the United States and in Europe is that given the nature of the attacks that we've seen, you don't have to deploy yourself to a combat zone in Iraq or Syria to pick up the skills. You can build these crude but lethal devices without going to Syria to learn how to do that. You can go on a terrorist rampage with firearms without going to Syria to learn how to do that. So while we need to be focused on those who may go and return with the superlative skills, you don't have to travel to a combat zone to acquire them, given the sophistication of their internet communication and their ability to train, recruit, and train online.
Very good point. We should also note here that you endorsed John Kasich in the GOP primary. But I want to get your response to Ted Cruz's suggestion that police patrol Muslim neighborhoods in the United States. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm very much troubled by it. I mean, I understand that ISIS is the target, and the Republican candidates have talked very specifically how to deal with it. But one of the critical means by which we will be able to identify before an attack occurs is to have the people in these communities and Muslim communities, and there's several around this country, who have who are very much a part of the American experience, of the American lifestyle, who embrace America's values. And the last thing we want to do is be sending a signal that somehow the broader community is a risk to us. No, there may be several individuals in that community that are a potential risk, but it is in our better interest not to suggest that everybody's a risk by increasing patrols, but to continue to do as some of the mayors and the FBI has done, is you work collaboratively with the Muslim leaders in that community, hoping to detect and identify the perpetrators before they act. So I thought it was a little bit too exaggerated, and I was not quite comfortable. No, not quite. I'm not comfortable with that notion that that's how you deal with terrorism, just by targeting Muslim communities writ large.
Well, I know a number of Muslim communities in the United States, too, have worked very hard to hire Muslim police officers, like here in New York City, in places like Minneapolis and San Diego, where they're trying to bridge with the Muslim community to try to get information. And sometimes along these lines, when you talk like this, that can really, it really shuts down what these communities have been trying to do.
Well, you know, when I heard Senator Cruz say that, we've got contrast here. We have a president who refuses to say radical Islam, just is not in his lexicon, adamant, never uses it, and he'll never use it in the remaining time. And that says one signal. Then we have a presidential candidate who, unfortunately, and maybe he pulled back from that a little bit, suggested that the way we can reduce the threat is to increase patrols and vigilance writ large in Muslim communities. The best folks to help us in those communities are law enforcement working with Muslim leaders and residents of those communities. So it seems to me that both extremes, neither extreme rather, really helps us identify the allies that we need within the Muslim community, both in the United States and overseas, in order to defeat the scourge of these global jihadists.
Switching back now a little bit, I want to ask you, these ISIS in particular is going after a number of these soft targets. What do you think we need to be doing here in the United States to shore up some of those soft targets?
One of the challenges, I think, in not only the United States but democracies writ large is that we are a target-rich environment. And the notion of soft targets, in my mind, is everything from, unfortunately, public transportation and airline counters to people walking down busy main streets in some urban centers to athletic events. So I think what we need to understand, a couple of things. You really need to do as best you can with intelligence to identify the perpetrator before they act. You need to strike out against those who promote the ideology, primarily overseas. If it's Shia ideology, it's Iran. Here's Sunni. The most recent manifestation of that is ISIS. So I think a heightened sense of vigilance is very important, and you're going to see that being ramped up. But we just have to be careful not to turn ourselves into one big secure zone under the notion that's the only way we can deal with this threat. The best way to deal with the threat is destroy the enemy over there, and we've been reluctant to build a coalition not only of U.S. Air and ground troops, but an international coalition, including our European friends who've ignored the reality as well, in addition to some Muslim countries that should be involved with us, and then take advantage of 700,000 men and women in blue in state and local police. I suspect that we could probably do a better job of information sharing based on some of the investigations that have probably been discussed by the FBI, by letting them put eyes on some of the people and some of the areas with which they're very concerned.
All right, Tom Ridge, former Secretary of Homeland Security, thank you so much for your expertise and being with us today.
Jamie, good talk with you. Thank you.